Welcome back, everyone, to more NASCAR Heat 2 coverage here at Pit Gaming. And boy, do we have a special one here today. Something is unlike anything else that you're going to encounter in the world, and that is Bristol. Bristol literally is unlike anything else you're going to encounter. We're going to have 35 to 40 high-powered stock cars going around a half-mile track that is banked way more than it need be. That can spell only two things: an exercise in frustration and patience. The biggest benefit that you're going to get from Bristol is you're going to learn just how patient you are and just how quickly you can get frustrated. The number one tip I can give you for Bristol has nothing to do with a setup or driving style. It's make sure you have the aspirin ready, because you're going to need it if you spend very much time at Bristol. But on to the good stuff. We're going to be talking about setups in all three of the series, because thank goodness all three of the NASCAR series race at Bristol, unlike what we looked at last time at Martinsville, where for whatever reason the Xfinity cars don't participate. So we're going to be talking about a little bit about lap times. We're going to be talking about the track itself and some approaches to running it. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, each time I do one of these setup videos, I don't plan ahead exactly how this is all going to get laid out, because it depends on how things turn out whenever I'm working on the setups for each of the three series. And today it's going to turn out a little bit different than it even has in previous times. We're going to start out here in the trucks. We're going to talk about the truck setup, then we're going to move into the Cup cars. And that is because the trucks and the Xfinity cars, I use a very almost identical setup between the two. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of flip the script a little bit, and I'm going to show you something very different as far as setup goes for the Cup cars. And what I like about that is it's going to give you some options. I'm going to give you a couple of choices for styles of setup and let you go about it and do with it what you choose. Try them both out and see what you like. See what works for you, what doesn't work for you. That's the idea that I'm trying to get across here. But before we get into that, let's talk briefly about the track itself. Very high banked, and the AI are going to try to run around basically the very top of the track here. So keep that in mind. If you're going to do any passing, you're going to have to do it on the bottom. And when I mean the bottom, I generally mean the very bottom. You can get up into the middle group some if you're passing one car at a time. However, particularly if you're going to go at it and try to get really aggressive and run 2 and 3 wide all the time, you're going to have to get used to hooking the bottom and being very good with your throttle control. And with that being said, let's talk a little bit about how you run this track. Bristol, the things I said in the introductory part of this video were very much serious. It's an exercise in patience and frustration. And if your patience starts to run thin, your frustration level goes up very quickly. And Bristol is a track that presents you with the challenge immediately. How are you going to race this track? Are you going to attack? Are you going to beat and bang on the AI and work your way to the front as quickly as possible? Or are you going to try to be more conservative, more methodical, and pass them one at a time and not worry about how quickly you get to the front, just the fact that you're going to end up getting to the front in a certain amount of time? Now, the gameplay footage I'm going to show you at the very end of this video is on the conservative side. I ran a 34, 35 lap race, whatever it ended up being, and I was in no hurry to get to the front. I made a decision from the very beginning that I was going to take my time and I was going to try to hook the bottom and basically not touch any other cars. Now, that's basically impossible here at Bristol. So yes, I ended up making contact, but I was trying to be basically ultra conservative until the very end of the race, when I had a little bit of fun for the last few laps. But I was taking a long run approach and not trying to get anywhere by passing 5 cars at the same time. I was being very patient. So keep that in mind whenever you watch. And the setup I was using is the Cup setup that you're going to see here in a little bit in the video. So again, Bristol is all about choices. How aggressive do you want to be? How aggressive do you not want to be? Well, the setup I have here, let's talk a little bit about the setup I use for the trucks and the Xfinity cars. Shocks, nothing new to talk about here, 10s across the board. Now, does that mean that you have to run 10s across the board? No, of course not. Feel free to play around with this. If you're having a little trouble with the car getting too loose off the corner, then maybe what you want to do is come down here to this right rear bump and reduce it some. Okay, maybe that's what you want to do. If you're having a little trouble getting into the corner, maybe it's a little bit too tight getting into the corner, maybe you want to come up here and reduce the right front bump. So you've got options here. By putting it straight tens across the board, which I like to do in general, just to keep things standard on the shock side of things, doesn't mean that I don't think that you should play around with these or touch these. In fact, I do a great deal whenever I am testing around with different things just to see how the shocks affect it. So by no means am I trying to tell you to stay away from the shocks. Let's move on to the weight settings. Left weight is maxed out because we're on an oval. We want all the weight to the left-hand side of the car or truck that we can get. Front weight is at 50% even. This is something that is going to be highly individual depending on how you drive the car. If you're very smooth on and off the throttle, no sudden jerky movements with the wheel, then you can get by with running a little bit more weight to the rear. If you like to make sudden movements, if you like to use the gas and the brake as on-off switches, meaning that you either completely on the gas or completely off it, and the same thing with the brakes, then you're probably going to have to move some more weight forward to stabilize the car. Here, I've got it at 50% even, just to help the car to rotate, particularly in the center of the corner. Wedge is at 51%. Again, that's just to give the car a little bit of feel in the steering wheel, something that I like, but by no means am I trying to tell you that you should not raise or lower that to fit your own personal needs. Next, let's talk about springs. 1,200 pounds on the left front, right front is at 1,000 pounds even. This is to help the car turn on entry. Now, the trucks, and even in the Xfinity cars, you really don't have the horsepower to worry about breaking loose and losing traction on the throttle. So this really isn't all that big of an issue. You can simply set the front springs to get you into the corner really well and not have to worry about it too much. What we'll see on the Cup car a little bit later is different, and part of the reason it's different is because they have so much more horsepower, and it's so much easier to break the rear tires loose and lose traction coming off the corner. And the rear, left rear spring, 350, right rear, 400. You can see only 50 pounds of rear spring split. This is part of the different type of setup that I was mentioning. There's very little split here so that you can get on the throttle very aggressively, and it doesn't have the negative side effect of getting you extremely loose as soon as you touch the gas pedal. Tire settings, not a whole lot going on here. 28s on the left, 32s on the right. That seemed to be a pretty good range and when I was looking at the tire temperatures for the inside, middle, and outside of the tire. Not perfect, but pretty good, and I didn't spend a whole lot of time there, mostly because I think this is an area that you guys can really get a lot of use out of if you want to tweak and tune on the setup. For instance, if you find that you're a little bit too tight from the center of the corner off, and in particular during a race, I've had a few messages asking me, what can I do during the race, during pit stops to make changes? Well, the interesting thing about this game is nothing changes during the race. The track doesn't change. The temperature, ambient temperature doesn't change. Nothing changes about the track. So what I'm talking to you about as far as making setup changes in these videos works exactly the same for pit road adjustments. So for instance, on the tires, if you want to make a pit road adjustment during the race, and let's say that it turns out you're a little bit too tight from the center of the corner off. Maybe you want to come down here, and maybe you want to lower the left rear pressure. Maybe you want to try increasing the right rear pressure. Either of those would work, or some combination of those. So those are just to give you some ideas. Let's say maybe that you're a little bit too tight on corner entry. Come up here, maybe lower the right front pressure a little bit. Things like that can really help you out during a race. On the flip side of that, if you are getting too loose on entry and you want to work with a pit stop, maybe increase the right front pressure a little bit, and that can help you out. Let's move on now to the miscellaneous settings. The camber, maxed out on both sides because we want all of the rotational ability and all the corner grip that we can possibly get. Front sway bar is at 1.15 inches, and that is the lowest, basically the lowest number I can reasonably get by with without losing too much stability in the car. So that's why it's run there. No rear sway bar. Let's move on to the track bar. 10 inches on the left side, 9.5 inches on the right side. that is a negative split, meaning that the left side is actually higher than the right side. I did that so that you could get back to the throttle. It helps you get through the center of the corner, but keeps you from getting loose when you're on the throttle. Again, a little bit different type of setup that I'm going to show you here in a few moments with the Cup car. Brake bias, again, is simply normally somewhere between 70 and 75%, just so that whenever I get hard on the brakes, the car doesn't want to spin out on me. So anywhere in that range is generally where I'll end up. So that number isn't really all that important to me, except to be roughly within that range. Grill tape, didn't mess with it. Wheel lock, I kept at the standard 10 degrees for me, simply because I prefer that feel in the wheel. Now, if you want to try 9 or 8 or something like that, then the wheel should be a little bit more responsive to you, a little bit more sensitive. Feel free to try that out. 10 degrees is simply, this is one of those settings that I like the feel of this, so I keep it there at the different tracks, just so I don't introduce other types of variables that I'm not used to. I like to stick with what I know, and 10 degrees feels good to me, so that's why I keep it there. But by no means, just like with the shocks, by no means am I trying to tell you that you shouldn't change it. Same thing if you want to increase this. If maybe you want to make the wheel a little bit less sensitive, by all means, go for it. Steering offset, 0.10, works good here at this track. The main thing you want to do here is make the car comfortable for you on the straightaway. Admittedly, there's not much straightaway to be had here at Bristol. You're going to spend most of your time in the corners. So adjust the steering offset to make it as comfortable as it can be on the straightaway. And the lower this number is on the steering offset, the more that the car or truck is going to pull to the left on the straightaway. And the more you increase it, the higher this number gets, the more that the car will either want to drive straight, or if you get it too high, will actually pull to the right. Gear settings. This is another area where it's going to be very different when we get to the Cup car setup. Here, I'm using 5.14 for the final drive, or the rear end ratio, and that was to get maximum RPMs. Now, this presents you with another opportunity to tune the setup, and this is something that you should really keep in mind, especially at a short track like this. 5.14 is basically the maximum amount of RPMs I could turn, well over 9,000, like 92, 9,300 here at this track. If you back down off of that to 5.0 or maybe 4.86, something around that range, you're going to lower the RPM some, and that's going to change the handling. In particular, it's going to make you a little bit tighter from the center off because you don't have so much torque from the rear tires to turn the car. So feel free to try that out. Maybe you want to lower this number a little bit and see how it reacts. Maybe you prefer the 5.14. Maybe you prefer something like a 4.86 gear. Again, options, things to test out and see what works best for you. All right, that's going to do it for the trucks. Now let's move over to the Cup car. All right, one thing I don't believe I mentioned were lap times when we were talking in the trucks. I usually like to get the lap times out of the way at the very beginning, and I can tell you, similar to what I mentioned in the Martinsville video, I spend very little, if any, time at Bristol looking at lap times. It's just not something I care about. What I do is, just like at Martinsville, I spend my time worrying about the feel and the driving style and approach that I want to use for the track. The lap times will take care of themselves. So I don't really know how fast or slow the lap times are. All I do is focus on the feel of the car or truck, and I work from there. The lap times are really irrelevant largely because you find yourself in traffic 95+% of the time that you're on the track. So lap times are going to be compromised at best anyway. And that's another reason why I focus on the feel of the car or truck in traffic. But let's talk briefly about those. In the trucks, I'm somewhere around a 17.5 second lap, 17.5, 17.6, somewhere in that range. I'm sure you can get quicker than that. But that's where I'm at roughly. Xfinity cars is 3 or 4 tenths faster than that, so somewhere in the 17.3 second range. And finally, the Cup cars, somewhere in the 16.9 second range. Again, I pay very little attention to those, especially during the race. I might look at them a little bit during practice, particularly if I get a clearer track, just to sort of see where I'm at. But during the race, not something that I look at all. So those are the lap times. Now let's move on to the setup. And there are some things that you're going to notice that are very similar or the same, but there are some things that you're going to notice that are quite different about this setup versus the truck / Xfinity setup that I was showing you earlier. All right, shocks, they're the same, 10s across the board. Same thing that I mentioned earlier. Feel free to mess around with those. And I gave you some suggestions on how to tweak those a little bit briefly. Let's move on to the weight settings. Left weight, again, maxed out. We want all the weight to the left we can because we're on an oval. Front weight, once again, is at 50%, and wedge is once again at 51%. Front and rear ride height are both at minimums, so nothing to really look at there. Here's where we start to notice some differences. Left front spring is at 1,100 pounds. Right front spring is at 1,200 pounds. The reason for this, again, this isn't saying that this doesn't work. This style of setup doesn't work in trucks or Xfinity. It absolutely can. I just had to separate them out, and this is how I chose to separate the different type of setup. I use the bigger right front spring here, similar to what I do at Martinsville. It gives me something that I can lean on in the corners, and it helps to stabilize the car by having a stiffer right front than left front. Going to the rear of the car, you can see before we had 50 pounds of rear spring split. Now we have 200. So a large change, and you might think this would get you really loose. Well, it doesn't because of some other things that we have going on in the setup, namely the front springs, also the gearing that we're going to look at in just a moment. So, but again, just want to give you some different options to show you on what you can do with the car to achieve the same or a similar goal. Moving over to, we're going to skip by the tires because those are the same as what we looked at before. Miscellaneous settings, a lot of this is the same as well. You notice on the track bar, however, that I have 9 inches on both sides, and that was for stability. The closer you can get the left and right sides to the same, the more stable the rear end is likely to be in the rotation. So here, because of the much higher horsepower numbers and ability to break out the rear tires and lose traction on those when under throttle, I wanted as much stability in the rear end as I could get. Brake bias, grill tape, wheel lock, steering offset, all of those are the same as what we looked at before, except the grill tape. I'm actually not sure what the grill tape was before because I didn't pay any attention to it. Now let's move on to the gear settings. I mentioned briefly before about you could use anywhere from a 5.14, maybe down to something like a 5.0 or a 4.86, or maybe even lower if you want to go. In this case, I'm using a 4.86 gear. This keeps me right around 9,000 RPMs peak. But what it allows me to do by going a little bit lower on the gear, lower in the rear end ratio number, not actual lower gear, what it does is allows me to increase the rear spring split. Now, the higher, in general, the more RPMs you're turning at a short track, you're going to be turning more RPMs in the center of the corner, and that means you're probably going to have to adjust the rear springs to accommodate that. Well, here you can see I'm able to get by with a couple of 100 pounds of split because I've chosen to lower the RPMs just a little bit. Again, I'm still around 9,000 RPMs, but I'm not at 92, 9,300 RPMs like I would be with a 5.14 gear. So those are the two different approaches to Bristol. You've got on one hand, very little rear spring split and using the front springs to really help the car to turn, running a lot of RPMs, that type of thing. Or you can run a little bit lower number on the rear end ratio and get by with more spring split in the rear and adjust your front springs and really give you something to lean on if you so choose. So hope you enjoyed the video. Stay tuned for that gameplay footage, which will be the Cup cars against the 105 strength AI on a, I believe, 35 lap race. And I start in the back, and you'll get to see how I take a very conservative approach to trying to work my way through traffic. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat 2 coverage here at NPIT Gaming.
Still a car out there. Outside, still there. Outside, clear. Easy, easy. Outside, still there. All clear. All clear, driver. That was a nice one. All clear, all clear. Easy, easy. Clear all the way. That was a nice one. Clear up top. Outside, still there. All clear. Outside, real tight. Outside, still there. Clear. Clear all around. Hold the bottom. Steady. Still there, he's outside. All clear. Clear low, stay low. Hold steady wheel. Hold steady wheel. Hold your line. Still a car out there. Hold your line. Outside, hold your line. Clear. Easy, easy. Hold your line. Outside, still there. Outside, still there. All clear, driver. Steady. Hold steady wheel. Clear high, quick. Get to the bottom, get to the bottom. Hold your line. All clear, all clear. Really good man. Stay in this rhythm. Clear low, stay low. Easy, easy. Outside. Hold your line. Halfway home. Still a car out